On a cold winter morning, the city of Brookhaven woke under a dull gray sky that seemed to press down on the streets like a heavy lid. The air was sharp, and a thin layer of frost clung to parked cars and window ledges. Most people were just beginning their day when the emergency call came in at 7:14 a.m. A man had been found dead in his apartment on Cedar Lane. At first, it sounded routine, the kind of call police officers receive far too often. But within hours, it would become clear that this death was anything but ordinary. Daniel Moore lived on the third floor of a quiet apartment building that had seen better days. The paint in the hallway was peeling, and the elevator often broke down, but the place was known for being calm. Daniel had lived there for almost 8 years without a single complaint. He was 39 years old, unmarried, and worked as an accountant at a mid-sized firm downtown. To his neighbors, he was polite but distant. He nodded when passing them in the hallway, sometimes exchanged a few words about the weather, and then disappeared behind his door. When the building manager unlocked Daniel's apartment for the police, the first thing that stood out was the silence. There was no television playing, no music, no signs of a struggle. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and something chemical, though no one could immediately identify what it was. The door had been locked from the inside, and the windows were shut tight, despite the apartment feeling strangely cold. Daniel's body lay on the kitchen floor, near the small table where he usually ate his meals. His eyes were open, staring upward, as if frozen in the middle of a thought. There were no visible injuries, no blood, no overturned furniture. His clothes were neat, his hair combed, and his watch still sat perfectly on his wrist. It looked less like a crime scene and more like a moment paused in time. The medical examiner arrived and quickly ruled out natural causes. Toxicology tests would later confirm that Daniel had been poisoned. The substance had been mixed into his drink, likely hours before his death. The poison worked slowly, shutting down his organs one by one while leaving almost no immediate signs of distress. Whoever chose it knew exactly what they were doing. Detective Laura Bennett arrived shortly after the initial officers secured the scene. She had been with the Brookhaven Police Department for over 15 years, and had worked her way up through cases most people would never forget. She was known for her calm presence and a sharp attention to detail. When she stepped into Daniel's apartment, she felt an unease she couldn't explain. It wasn't the sight of the body that unsettled her. It was the absence of chaos. She moved carefully through the apartment, taking in every detail. The couch cushions were perfectly aligned. The bookshelf was organized by size and color. The sink was empty, dishes washed and dried. Even Daniel's shoes were placed neatly by the door. It was clear that he was a man who liked order. But something felt wrong. Too controlled. Too clean. Forensic officers began dusting for fingerprints. They checked the door handle, the light switches, the kitchen counter, the glass on the table, and even the remote control. One by one, they shook their heads. There were no usable prints. Not Daniel's. Not anyone else's. It was as if the apartment had been wiped clean with purpose. "That's impossible," one of the younger officers whispered. Laura Bennett didn't respond. She crouched beside the kitchen table and studied the glass sitting near Daniel's hand. There was still a small amount of liquid inside. It had no smell and no color. She knew better than to touch it, but she leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. "This wasn't rushed," she said quietly. "This was planned." The neighbors were questioned throughout the morning. Most of them had little to say. No loud noises. No arguments. No unfamiliar faces. One woman on the second floor mentioned hearing footsteps late at night, but in an apartment building, that meant very little. Another neighbor said Daniel had come home around his usual time the evening before, carrying groceries. Nothing seemed out of place. Security cameras in the building should have provided answers, but they didn't. The system had been offline that night due to what the building manager called a technical issue. It was a coincidence that felt too convenient to ignore. As the hours passed, the case only grew stranger. Daniel's phone showed no suspicious messages or calls. His email inbox was clean. His computer history revealed nothing unusual. His bank accounts showed no recent withdrawals or signs of blackmail. There was no forced entry, no theft, and no obvious motive. By the afternoon, news of the death began to spread. Reporters gathered outside the building. Cameras pointed toward the entrance. Words like mysterious and baffling filled the headlines. The police department felt the pressure almost immediately. Inside the apartment, Laura stood alone for a moment, staring at the quiet room. She imagined Daniel sitting at the table, drinking from the glass, unaware that his final hours had already been decided. She wondered if he had felt fear, or if the poison had taken him so gently that he never realized what was happening. Cases like this disturbed her more than violent ones. There was something deeply unsettling about a murder that left no marks, no mess, and no trace of human presence. It suggested patience, control, confidence. Before leaving, Laura took one last look around the apartment. She had learned to trust her instincts over the years, and right now, they were screaming one thing. This was not an isolated incident. Whoever had killed Daniel Moore had done it before, or at the very least, had planned to do it again. The careful removal of fingerprints, the choice of poison, and the locked room appearance all pointed to someone who understood investigations, someone who knew exactly what police looked for and how to avoid leaving it behind. As night fell over Brookhaven, Daniel Moore's body was taken away, and his apartment was sealed. The building returned to its quiet routine, but something had changed. An invisible line had been crossed. A killer had walked into a man's life, erased him without violence, and vanished without a trace. Detective Laura Bennett stood outside, watching the flashing lights reflect off the frost-covered pavement. She felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. This was only the beginning, and somewhere in the city, the person responsible was already thinking about their next move. The days following Daniel Moore's death were filled with unanswered questions. Detective Laura Bennett barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the image of that spotless apartment and the empty glass on the table. Crimes usually left something behind. A mistake, a mark, a careless move. But this one felt like it had been designed to leave nothing at all. Laura started where she always did, by rebuilding the victim's life piece by piece. She wanted to understand Daniel Moore not just as a body on a kitchen floor, but as a person. His co-workers described him as reliable and quiet. He arrived at work on time, finished his tasks early, and rarely joined office conversations. He never talked about his personal life. No one could remember him arguing with anyone or showing anger. At first, it felt like a dead end. Daniel's life was almost painfully normal. Then Laura turned her attention to Daniel's digital records. His phone showed little activity outside of work hours. No late-night calls. No threatening messages. His social media accounts were rarely used and carefully managed. But when Laura examined his email more closely, something subtle caught her eye. Over the last 6 months, Daniel had exchanged messages with several people asking for financial advice. That wasn't unusual for an accountant, but these emails were different. The tone was always calm and polite. The questions were specific, but never personal. Each sender used a different name, yet the writing style was the same. Short sentences, careful wording, no emotion. Laura felt a quiet tension build in her chest. She traced the email addresses and found they were created using public networks and temporary services. Whoever sent them didn't want to be followed. That alone raised concern, but what followed made it worse. Daniel had met at least 3 of these people in person. Receipts from cafes around the city showed meetings scheduled during Daniel's lunch breaks or early evenings. The locations were always busy places with lots of people and constant movement. Laura visited the cafes herself, speaking to staff and managers, showing them photos of Daniel. Most remembered him. He sat by the window, one barista said. Always ordered the same thing. Black coffee. When Laura asked about the person Daniel met with, the answers became uncertain. He was just normal, a waiter said slowly. Average height, Brown coat. I don't remember his face. Another cafe employee frowned, trying to focus. I remember the chair more than him. He always sat with his back to the wall. That detail repeated itself again and again. The unknown man always chose a position where he could see everything. He arrived early and left first. He paid in cash. And once again, there were no fingerprints found on cups, tables, or doors. It was as if he had passed through these places without ever touching them. Laura reviewed security footage from the cafes. The man appeared in grainy frames, sitting across from Daniel, his face partially hidden or turned away. His movements were calm, controlled. He never looked at the cameras, never rushed, never lingered. He's like a shadow, one cafe manager said quietly. You see him, but you don't remember him. That sentence stayed with Laura. As she pieced together the timeline, something became clear. These meetings had stopped 2 weeks before Daniel's death. Whatever the conversations were about, they had reached their end. Laura presented her findings to the department. Some officers believed it was a professional hit, maybe connected to money laundering or corporate crime. Others thought it was an obsessed client or someone seeking revenge. But no theory felt complete. Then, 3 weeks after Daniel's death, the phone rang again. Another body had been found. Clara Evans was 42 years old and lived alone in a small house near the edge of the city. Like Daniel, she had no criminal record and no obvious enemies. Like Daniel, she had been poisoned. Her home showed no signs of forced entry. And like Daniel's apartment, there were no fingerprints anywhere. The similarities were impossible to ignore. This time, the city felt the fear immediately. News outlets connected the cases within hours. Headlines spoke of a killer who vanished without leaving evidence. Social media filled with rumors and panic. People began wearing gloves in public places, wiping down their homes, checking locks repeatedly. Laura visited Clara's home late that night. It had the same unsettling feeling as Daniel's apartment. Clean, silent, carefully arranged. It felt staged, like a performance meant to confuse and impress. As the forensic team worked, Laura searched Clara's personal records. The pattern continued. Emails asking for advice. Meetings in public places. A man no one could clearly remember. 2 victims were no longer a coincidence. The department formed a task force, and Laura was placed in charge. She spent hours comparing the cases, marking similarities, removing distractions. The killer was patient, organized, intelligent. He chose victims who lived alone and wouldn't be missed immediately. He used poison that caused delayed symptoms. He erased his presence completely. But the most disturbing part was his confidence. Days later, a 3rd victim was discovered. By now, the city was holding its breath. The media gave the killer a name, the Ghost Killer. But Laura hated it. It made him sound unreal, like a myth. She knew he was very real, and that made him more dangerous. In her private notes, she wrote a different name. The killer who left no fingerprints. Late one night, alone in her office, Laura stared at the photos of the victims pinned to the wall. 3 normal lives ended without warning. She thought about the man in the cafes, the one with no shadow. She imagined him watching, planning, calculating every move with care. This wasn't violence driven by emotion. This was something colder. She realized then that the killer wasn't hiding out of fear. He was hiding because he enjoyed control. And as long as he remained unseen, he would keep killing. Laura closed her notebook and stood up, her jaw tight with determination. Somewhere in Brookhaven, the man with no shadow was moving quietly through the city, blending in, leaving nothing behind. But she promised herself one thing. Shadows only exist where there is light. And she would find him. By the time the 3rd victim was found, the city of Brookhaven had changed. The streets felt quieter, not because there were fewer people, but because everyone seemed to be listening. People locked their doors earlier. Cafe conversations lowered to whispers. Strangers were watched more closely. Fear had settled into daily life, slow and steady, like a shadow that refused to move. The third victim was a man named Harold Finch. He was 50 years old and lived in a modest townhouse near the old railway tracks. Harold worked as an insurance clerk and had been with the same company for over 20 years. His life followed a predictable pattern. Work, home, television, sleep. He had no known enemies and no history of conflict. His body was discovered by a co-worker who grew concerned after Harold failed to show up for work 2 days in a row. When police entered the townhouse, they already knew what they would find. The scene matched the others almost perfectly. No forced entry. No fingerprints. No sign of struggle. Harold had been poisoned, likely through his evening tea. The cup sat cleanly in the sink, washed and placed upside down, as if someone had taken the time to tidy up after killing him. Detective Laura Bennett stood in the doorway of the kitchen, feeling the now familiar weight in her chest. 3 victims. 3 carefully erased crime scenes. 3 lives ended with chilling precision. Whatever doubts had remained were gone. This was a serial killer, and he was operating with patience and purpose. The task force grew larger, but progress remained slow. For every theory, there was a wall. For every possible lead, there was nothing solid to hold on to. The killer seemed to exist outside normal patterns of human behavior. He did not rush. He did not brag. He did not leave messages. He simply appeared, acted, and vanished. Laura decided it was time to stop focusing on how the victims died and start asking why they were chosen. She gathered everything they had on Daniel Moore, Clara Evans, and Harold Finch and began laying their lives side by side. At first, there was nothing obvious connecting them. Different ages, different jobs, different neighborhoods. No shared friends. No shared routines. It felt intentional, as if the killer had gone out of his way to avoid patterns. But Laura refused to accept that. She worked late into the night, reading through old documents, court records, archived news articles, and forgotten case files. She read slowly, carefully, paying attention to details most people would skip. Names, dates, locations, small mentions buried in long reports. Then, sometime after midnight, she found it. Years earlier, all 3 victims had been involved in the same court case. It had been a major fraud trial that once dominated the local news. A powerful businessman had been accused of stealing millions through false investments and hidden accounts. The case had drawn public attention and anger. People wanted justice. They wanted accountability. Daniel Moore had served as a financial expert witness. Clara Evans had testified about document handling. Harold Finch had worked in insurance and provided evidence about false claims. All 3 had taken the stand, and all 3 had pointed their words toward the same man, Victor Hale. Laura leaned back in her chair, her heart beating faster. Victor Hale had been a rising figure in the business world, known for his charm and intelligence. During the trial, he appeared calm and confident. But the case had fallen apart in its final weeks when key evidence went missing. Without it, the prosecution failed. Victor Hale walked free. The public had been furious, but over time, the story faded. Victor Hale vanished from the spotlight soon after. No interviews, no appearances, no updates. Laura searched current records. There was nothing. No address. No active business licenses. No social media presence. It was as if Victor Hale had disappeared completely. She shared her discovery with the task force the next morning. The room fell silent as she spoke. The idea was disturbing, but it made sense. The victims weren't random. They were chosen. Each one had played a role in a moment that changed Victor Hale's life. But there was a problem. If Victor Hale had wanted revenge, why wait so long? The trial had ended nearly 8 years ago. Why now? Laura didn't have an answer yet, but she believed the timing mattered. People like Victor Hale didn't forget. They planned. They waited until the moment felt right. As the team dug deeper into Victor Hale's past, they uncovered unsettling details. During the trial, Hale had displayed an unusual knowledge of legal procedures and forensic processes. He asked sharp questions. He corrected his own lawyers at times. He seemed fascinated not just with winning, but with the system itself. One former colleague described him as obsessed with control. Another detail stood out. After the trial, Victor Hale had sold all his known assets within months. Properties, investments, vehicles. He had turned everything into liquid cash and then vanished. It was a perfect setup for a new identity. The pressure on the task force increased as the media caught wind of the connection. Reporters speculated about revenge and long-term planning. Public fear deepened. If the killer was targeting witnesses, who might be next? Laura knew they were running out of time. Then something unexpected happened. A fourth victim survived. Emily Carter was rushed to the hospital after collapsing in her apartment. Doctors found traces of the same poison used in the other murders, but in a smaller dose. She had fallen unconscious before it could fully take effect. Someone had miscalculated. When Laura arrived at the hospital, Emily was pale but alive. She spoke in a weak voice, her eyes wide with fear. "I didn't see him," Emily said. "I just remember feeling dizzy." Laura asked about emails, meetings, any contact with strangers. Emily nodded slowly. "There was a man," she said. "He asked about an old case. He was polite. Too polite." The case Emily referred to matched the same fraud trial. Laura felt a sharp chill. This confirmed it. Victor Hale was back, and he was hunting anyone connected to that courtroom. As Laura left the hospital, she realized something else. The killer wasn't just erasing witnesses. He was revisiting the past, reliving it. And if that was true, then the list of potential victims was longer than they feared. Back in her office, Laura stared at the board covered in names and photos. She saw the pattern now, clear and terrifying. The silence around the crimes wasn't emptiness. It was intention. Victor Hale had spent years hiding, studying, and preparing. He had learned how to move without being noticed, how to touch without leaving traces, how to kill without chaos. He believed he was correcting history. Laura clenched her fists. She knew this kind of killer wouldn't stop on his own. He wouldn't make a mistake easily. He wouldn't rush. But everyone made mistakes eventually. And when Victor Hale did, she had to be ready, because the pattern was no longer hidden. It was counting down. By the time Detective Laura Bennett officially connected the murders to Victor Hale, the pressure on the task force became unbearable. The city council demanded updates. The police chief wanted results. The media waited outside the station day and night, hungry for any detail that could turn fear into headlines. But the most dangerous pressure came from something far quieter. The knowledge that Victor Hale was still free and still choosing his next move. Laura knew one thing with certainty. Victor Hale was not acting blindly. He was careful, methodical, and deeply patient. He studied people before approaching them. He watched their routines. He waited until the moment felt perfect. That meant the police could not simply chase him. They had to think the way he thought. They had to invite him out of hiding. The idea of a trap was discussed late one evening in the task force room. Maps covered the walls. Case files lay open on tables. Coffee cups sat untouched as exhaustion took hold. Laura listened as officers debated possibilities, most of which felt too obvious, too loud, too careless. "He won't take risks," Laura finally said. "Not unless he believes he's in control." That sentence changed the direction of the conversation. They needed a bait that felt real, personal, and irresistible. Something connected directly to Victor Hale's past. Something that would make him believe history was repeating itself. That was when Emily Carter's name came up. Emily was an undercover officer with experience in long-term identity work. She had already survived one attempt on her life, and that alone made Laura hesitate. But Emily volunteered before Laura could object. She understood the danger, and she understood the stakes. "If he's still following the list," Emily said calmly, "he'll come back for me." He won't like unfinished business. A new identity was built for her within days. Records were planted carefully, matching the same patterns as the previous victims. Fake court documents were leaked into online legal forums. A false connection was quietly created between Emily and the old fraud trial. Every detail was crafted to look natural, unforced, and invisible. Emily moved into a small apartment on the east side of the city. It matched the profile perfectly. Quiet neighborhood, single resident, predictable routine. On the surface, she looked unprotected. In reality, she was surrounded. Hidden cameras were installed in nearby buildings. Unmarked police cars rotated shifts outside the block. Officers monitored digital traffic and physical movement around the clock. Laura personally reviewed every security detail, knowing one mistake could cost a life. For several days, nothing happened. Emily went about her routine, leaving for work, returning home, stopping at the same cafe each morning. She received emails that matched the same calm, polite tone seen in the earlier cases. The messages asked about financial records, legal confusion, and clearing old misunderstandings. Emily responded just enough to keep the conversation alive. Laura felt the tension tighten with every passing hour. Then, one night, everything went wrong. At 2:17 a.m., the power in Emily's building went out. Not just her apartment, but the entire block. Within seconds, backup systems should have activated. They didn't. Monitors in the command room went dark. Laura was already moving before anyone spoke. She grabbed her coat and headed for the door as officers scrambled to restore feeds and contact units on the ground. Radio chatter filled the room, sharp and panicked. By the time Laura arrived at the building, the power had returned. Officers flooded the area, weapons drawn. Emily's apartment door was closed and locked. Laura knocked once, then twice. Emily answered. She was alive. Her face was pale, her hand shaking slightly, but there were no visible injuries. The apartment looked untouched. No signs of struggle. No forced entry. No broken windows. On the small dining table sat a single piece of paper. Laura picked it up carefully, wearing gloves. The note contained only 4 words, written in neat, deliberate handwriting. I know who you are. The room felt suddenly colder. Emily sat down slowly, her breath unsteady. She explained that she had been lying awake when the power went out. At first, she thought it was a normal outage. Then she felt something else. A presence. Not a sound. Not a movement. Just the overwhelming feeling that someone was there. I didn't see him, Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I knew he was close. I knew he was watching. When the lights came back on, the note was on the table. That was it. Victor Hale had entered a fully monitored apartment, surrounded by police, and left without being seen. No fingerprints were found. No DNA. No trace of forced entry. Even the cameras inside the apartment showed nothing. They had been disabled silently and reactivated without alerting the system. The trap had failed. Back at headquarters, the mood was grim. Officers replayed footage again and again, searching for anything they might have missed. Laura studied the note under magnification. The handwriting was calm, controlled, and precise. It matched Victor Hale's signature from years ago. There was no doubt in them all. This wasn't just a killer avoiding capture. This was a man sending a message. Laura realized something important in that moment. Victor Hale hadn't come to kill Emily. He could have. The poison, the timing, the opportunity, all of it was there. But he chose not to. He came to prove a point. He wanted the police to know he was ahead of them, that he could walk into their trap and walk out untouched, that their rules, their systems, their surveillance meant nothing to him. For the first time since the case began, Laura felt anger replace fear. Victor Hale was no longer just correcting the past. He was enjoying the present. The police chief ordered increased protection for all known witnesses from the old trial. But Laura knew it wouldn't be enough. Victor didn't act out of urgency. He acted out of confidence. He would wait. He would adapt. Late that night, Laura sat alone in her office, the note resting on her desk. She thought about Victor Hale sitting somewhere in the city, calm and patient, knowing exactly what he had done to them. Then she noticed something small. The paper. It wasn't from Emily's apartment. It wasn't from any notebook or printer in the building. It was older, slightly yellowed at the edges. Laura traced its origin and found the answer buried in an old evidence archive. The paper matched the type used in the courthouse during the fraud trial years ago. Victor Hale hadn't just entered the trap. He had brought the past with him. Laura smiled for the first time in days, though there was no joy in it. Victor Hale had made a mistake, not in how he entered, not in how he left, but in what he chose to show. And now, for the first time, Laura felt the balance shift. The trap had failed, but the game had truly begun. The discovery about the paper changed everything. For Detective Laura Bennett, it was the first real crack in Victor Hale's perfect control. The paper was not a threat by accident. It was chosen with intention. Hale wanted the past to breathe again, to sit in front of the police like an old ghost that refused to stay buried. But in doing so, he revealed something he had carefully hidden for years. Nostalgia. People who truly disappear cut all emotional ties. They don't carry symbols. They don't revisit memories. Victor Hale did. And that meant he was still human, no matter how much he tried to convince himself otherwise. Laura ordered a full review of everything connected to the old fraud trial. Not just the witnesses or the evidence, but the building itself. Who worked there? Who cleaned it? Who had access to supplies, documents, and private rooms? She wasn't looking for Victor directly anymore. She was looking for habits. The breakthrough came from someone no one had thought to question before. A retired courthouse janitor named Samuel Ricks called the department after seeing a news report about the case. His voice was shaky but clear. "I think I remember the man you're looking for," he said. Laura met him the same afternoon in a quiet interview room. Samuel was in his late 70s, thin and hunched, with hands rough from decades of work. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. "I cleaned the courthouse every night during that trial," Samuel said. "Most people blur together after a while. Judges, lawyers, witnesses. But that man stood out." Laura leaned forward. "Why?" Samuel looked down at his hands. "Because he never touched anything." That caught her attention. "He wore gloves," Samuel continued. "Thin medical ones. All the time. Even when he was alone. Even when he didn't need them. I remember thinking it was strange. People joked about it back then. Said he was afraid of germs." Laura felt a chill run through her. Victor Hale hadn't learned to erase fingerprints later. He had been practicing for years. Samuel went on to explain that Hale often stayed late in the courthouse, sitting alone in empty rooms after hearings ended. He would read documents, take notes, and watch people without speaking. He rarely acknowledged stuff. He moved quietly, almost respectfully, like someone who didn't want to disturb the space. He wasn't angry, Samuel said. He was focused. That word stayed with Laura long after the interview ended. Focused. With Samuel's information, the task force shifted strategies. Instead of searching for Victor Hale as a ghost, they searched for him as a planner. Someone who lived by rules. Someone who followed routines. Financial records finally began to reveal a faint trail. Victor Hale had been careful, but not careless. He used shell companies layered beneath shell companies, but all of them led back to one region outside the city. A quiet rural area with old houses and few neighbors. Places where privacy was natural and questions were rare. Laura and her team moved quietly. No sirens. No media. No announcements. They arrived just before dawn. The house sat at the end of a narrow road, surrounded by trees stripped bare by winter. The structure was old but well-maintained. Lights glowed softly inside. Someone was awake. Laura felt her heart beat faster as officers took their positions. When they knocked, the door opened almost immediately. Victor Hale stood there calmly, wearing a simple sweater and clean slacks. No gloves this time. His hair was slightly grayer than in his trial photos, but his face was unmistakable. Sharp eyes. Controlled expression. A man who expected this moment. "I was wondering when you'd come," he said quietly. He didn't resist arrest. Inside the house, officers found what Laura had feared and expected. A room lined with shelves. Notebooks arranged with perfect precision. Each one labeled with a name. Daniel Moore, Clara Evans, Harold Finch, others who had not yet been reached. Inside the notebooks were details that made Laura's stomach tighten. Daily routines, favorite cafes, seating preferences, health notes, emotional observations. Victor Hale hadn't just watched his victims. He had studied them. In another room, they found cleaning supplies, gloves, chemicals, and books on forensic science. Everything was legal. Everything was careful. Everything was deliberate. Victor Hale was taken into custody without incident. During the interrogation, he sat straight-backed, hands folded, eyes steady. He did not ask for a lawyer immediately. He did not appear nervous. "You believe you're smarter than everyone else," Laura said after a long silence. Victor smiled faintly. "No, I believe I was more patient." He spoke slowly, as if explaining something obvious. "They stood in a courtroom and told half-truths," he said. "They destroyed my name, my work, my future. I lost everything because of them." "You were acquitted," Laura replied. Victor's eyes hardened. Acquitted is not the same as restored. He didn't describe the murders as killings. He avoided the word entirely. "I didn't act in anger," he said. "I acted in balance. I gave each of them time. Yes, in fact, I let them live their lives. I wanted them comfortable, safe, unafraid." Laura felt her jaw tighten. "You erased them," she said. Victor nodded. "Exactly." The trial that followed captivated the nation. Prosecutors laid out the evidence piece by piece. Financial links, witness testimony, surveillance gaps explained by careful timing and insider knowledge. The notebooks, the chemicals, the handwriting. Victor Hale listened without reaction. When he finally spoke in court, his voice was calm. "I didn't leave fingerprints," he said, "because fingerprints are mistakes. I don't make mistakes." The jury disagreed. Victor Hale was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The city of Brookhaven slowly began to breathe again. People returned to cafes. Locks felt less heavy. Fear loosened its grip. But for Laura, the case never truly ended. She visited the evidence room weeks later and stood before the sealed boxes containing Victor's notebooks. Lives reduced to observations. Humanity turned into data. She thought about how close he had come to never being caught. If not for a piece of old paper. If not for a forgotten janitor. If not for a single emotional choice. Victor Hale had believed silence made him invisible. But silence, Laura knew, always leaves echoes. As she left the station that night, snow began to fall lightly, covering the city in white. Footprints appeared and disappeared with every passing step. No one leaves nothing behind forever. Not even the killer who left no fingerprints.